Marcelo e os alunos também da UFRJ, Isis, Beatriz, Pedro, que tiveram um gigantesco trabalho para que esse evento acontecesse. Então aqui meu muito obrigada e as boas-vindas. Espero que nós tenhamos excelentes discussões, né, mais aprofundadas, e que possamos encaminhar, né, a partir então desses 2 dias de debate, no terceiro dia, na nossa reunião aí no final, né, dessa jornada, uma série de atividades, produtos, né, ideias que a gente possa estar continuando, que isso seja somente um primeiro encontro em relações internacionais e marxismo, mas não só um encontro pontual, isso seja o início aí de um processo. Tá? Obrigada.
Bom, eu queria agradecer em nome da UFRJ, do PEP, queria anunciar também a presença da vice-coordenadora do PEP, a professora Isabela Nogueira, que acaba de chegar, agradecer em nome do LEC, que coordena essa parceria que tornou possível a realização desse colóquio Relações Internacionais e Marxismo, que é um colóquio que busca contribuir para organizar um campo de pensamento no Brasil sobre relações internacionais desde o ponto de vista marxista. Consideramos que a organização desse campo é de extraordinária importância no momento onde as forças retrógradas, reacionárias, assumem uma forte ofensiva na economia internacional e particularmente no Brasil, lançando o nosso país rumo a um cenário extremamente nebuloso, submetendo o nosso país a uma emenda constitucional que impõe o rentismo como trajetória de futuro desse país, não é? Condenando o nosso país violentamente nos caminhos do subdesenvolvimento e retirando qualquer perspectiva de futuro para as novas gerações de trabalhadores brasileiros e para a juventude brasileira. Então, consideramos que pensar estrategicamente o mundo é um passo fundamental para a transformação. Daí a enorme importância de se organizar um campo crítico no âmbito das relações internacionais. Então, esse colóquio tem esse sentido e, por isso, nos motivamos a realizá-lo, mesmo nessa conjuntura tão desanimadora. Desanimadora por várias razões colocadas aqui pela Ana, a questão da crise financeira do país, crise financeira especificamente no Estado do Rio de Janeiro, uma situação onde as universidades brasileiras têm sido fortemente atingidas. Temos a notícia agora de que ontem a Light cortou a energia da reitoria da UFRJ, então esse é o cenário com o qual nós estamos lidando, mas isso não nos abate e, na verdade, nos provoca a nos desdobrarmos no sentido de avançarmos rumo a uma perspectiva crítica e revolucionária de compreensão da realidade em que estamos nos situando, né? Nós estamos realmente num tempo onde o centrismo liberal está se esgotando fortemente e num tempo onde é necessário avançar de forma bastante contundente com um pensamento ousado para transformar a realidade. Então, com essa perspectiva que nós abrimos esse colóquio, aproveitamos essa oportunidade para homenagearmos 2 grandes figuras, que são figuras lutadoras pela soberania dos povos latino-americanos, figuras lutadoras pela humanidade, contra o jugo do capital que é estabelecido sobre ela. A primeira figura que nós homenageamos, falecida ano passado, é a da Beverly, uma intelectual latino-americana da maior importância, uma autora chave no campo da teoria marxista da dependência. E também somamos nesse colóquio as homenagens internacionais que têm sido feitas a Fidel Castro. Então, colocamos esse colóquio como parte também das homenagens que têm sido prestadas a Fidel Castro e convidamos aqui leitor a ler o pronunciamento que o Fidel Castro fez na ONU, um pronunciamento que vai tomar aqui uns 5 minutos, mas que é de extraordinária importância, extraordinária atualidade, para entendermos as grandes questões que permeiam ainda o século XXI. Ao contrário do que se tentou dizer, que a morte de Fidel Castro encerrava o século XX, não. A morte de Fidel Castro, na verdade, elimina o homem, mas transforma a figura de Fidel Castro em uma figura presente, profundamente presente nas lutas que nós teremos que travar no século XXI para transformar o mundo em um mundo que seja habitável e que seja efetivamente dirigido para as necessidades da humanidade.
Um discurso de Fidel Castro na Assembleia Geral da ONU de 1979, onde ele denuncia as relações desiguais entre os países. Sempre se fala de direitos humanos, mas também temos de falar sobre os direitos da humanidade. Porque algumas pessoas têm de andar descalças, enquanto outras viajam em carros de luxo? Porque alguns têm de viver 35 anos para que outros possam viver mais de 70? Porque alguns têm de ser miseravelmente pobres para que outros sejam excessivamente ricos? Falo em nome das crianças no mundo que não têm um pedaço de pão. Falo em nome de pacientes que não têm medicamentos. Falo àqueles a quem tem sido negado o direito à vida e à dignidade humana. Alguns países têm mar, outros não. Alguns têm recursos energéticos, outros não. Alguns têm terras abundantes para produzir alimentos, outros não. Alguns são saturados com máquinas e fábricas, ao ponto de não poderem respirar o ar de sua atmosfera envenenada. Outros não possuem mais do que seus braços magros para ganhar a vida. Alguns têm, em suma, recursos abundantes, outros não têm nada. Qual o destino deles? Morrerem? Se tornarem eternamente pobres? Para que serve então a civilização? O que é a consciência do homem? O que são as Nações Unidas? O que é o mundo? Vocês não podem falar de paz em nome de dezenas de milhões de pessoas que morrem a cada ano de fome ou de doenças curáveis no mundo inteiro. Vocês não podem falar de paz em nome de 900 milhões de analfabetos. A exploração dos países pobres pelos países ricos deve cessar. Eu sei que em muitos países pobres há exploradores explorados. Viro para os países ricos a contribuir. Dirijo-me aos países pobres para distribuir. Chega de palavras, precisamos de ações. Chega de abstrações. É preciso ações concretas. Chega de especulações sobre uma nova ordem econômica internacional que ninguém entende. Temos de falar sobre uma ordem real e objetiva que todos entendam. Eu não vim aqui para falar como um profeta da revolução. Eu não vim para pedir ou querer uma convulsão violenta do mundo. Viemos para falar de paz e cooperação entre os povos. E nós temos vindo a perceber que, se não resolvermos pacificamente e sabiamente injustiças e desigualdades, o futuro será apocalíptico. O barulho das armas, a linguagem ameaçadora da arrogância no cenário internacional deve cessar. Chega da ilusão de que os problemas do mundo podem ser resolvidos com armas nucleares. As bombas poderão matar os famintos, os doentes e os ignorantes. mas as bombas não podem matar a fome, a doença, a ignorância. Elas não podem matar a rebelião justa dos povos. E no Holocausto, todos morrem. Ricos são os que mais têm a perder nesse mundo. Obrigado.
Antes de nós entrarmos na nossa mesa inicial, eu passaria a palavra aqui para os alunos para falarem algumas questões organizativas aqui em relação ao ocorrer do nosso dia.
Oi, gente, bom dia. Eu sou Yasmin, sou aluna da Rural. É um prazer receber vocês aqui. Vou dar 3 recados importantes. O primeiro deles é sobre o credenciamento. Então, todo mundo que chegar, peço que assine a lista e pegue o bloquinho e tudo. E a equipe de organização personalizada com esse adesivo. Então, qualquer dúvida que vocês tiverem, é só entrar em contato com a gente que a gente vai tentar resolver. Outra coisa em relação ao nosso almoço, a gente conseguiu negociar com um restaurante e reservar uma mesa para os participantes do colóquio. Então nós vamos passar uma lista para vocês assinarem, para que a gente consiga fazer uma reserva que atenda a maioria. O restaurante é o restaurante Bustone, na Rua da Alfândega, e o valor da comida o quilo é R$36,90. O último recado é sobre o Wi-Fi. A rede é livre, é só vocês entrarem, UFRRJ, e é isso, basicamente. Um ótimo colóquio pra gente. Não tem senha. É isso, tá? Um ótimo colóquio. Obrigada.
Bom, então iniciamos a parte acadêmica do nosso colóquio com a nossa primeira mesa, que se chama Marxismo como teoria e prática das relações internacionais. Essa mesa é composta pelo professor Léo Vitor Panitz, que é professor da Universidade de York, professor de Economia Política Comparada da Universidade de York, e que tem diversos trabalhos publicados, entre eles Capitalismo Global, o Império Americano, o fim do socialismo parlamentar, a renovação do socialismo, democracia, estratégia e imaginação, e a feitura do capitalismo global, a economia política do Império Americano. Esses são alguns dos trabalhos do professor Léo Panitz. A mesa também está composta pela professora Beverly, que é diretora do Giovanni RID Center sobre estudos globais, é professora titular do Departamento de Sociologia da Johns Hopkins University e tem também um enorme conjunto de trabalhos publicados, entre eles no Brasil, Forças do Trabalho, que foi publicada pela Boitempo. Também a professora Beverly organizou com o Giovanni Arrighi o livro Causa e Governabilidade no Moderno Sistema Mundial e tem diversos artigos publicados, entre eles Trabalho, Guerra e a Dinâmica Contemporânea da Política Mundial em Perspectiva Mundial Histórica. Temos também na mesa o professor Manuel Fernandes, que é professor da UFRJ, professor do IRID, da PUC, Instituto de Relações Internacionais da PUC. O professor Manuel Fernandes foi diretor científico da FAPERJ, foi secretário executivo da FINEP, secretário executivo do Ministério de Ciência e Tecnologia e presidente da FINEP. Do Ministério da Ciência e Tecnologia, pelo governo golpista do Michel Temer. E o professor Manuel Fernandes também tem uma vasta obra publicada e, sobretudo, em questões de hegemonia e transição para o novo ciclo nacional e questões sobre crescimento global e desigualdade internacional. Então, sem mais delongas, eu abro então a palavra, professor Léo Panet. Estamos pensando aí mais ou menos em torno de 40 minutos de exposição inicial para cada um dos participantes.
Thank you very much, James. Well, first of all, let me congratulate all of the organizers of this really remarkable colloquium. International relations as a subdiscipline of political science and Marxism traditionally go together like oil and water. They don't mix. To a significant extent, insofar as what we now understand as critical Marxist studies of international relations, of the international arena, was to be found in the mid-20th century. You would find it more in history departments. I'm thinking of E.H. Carr, or Gabriel Kolko, or his professor, William Appleman Williams, at the University of Wisconsin. You would even find it sometimes in economics departments, amazingly enough. Maurice Daub at Cambridge, but not very commonly. You would find it much more commonly, of course, in sociology departments, where especially Marxists practicing world systems theory located themselves. And in the post-war period, as you got the explosion of new subfields of study, you found them in development, area studies programs. The breakthrough in political science really only came in the 1960s, 1970s, when the Marxist theory of the state led to a bit of a revolution in my own field, in comparative politics. And in international relations today, and this is really a new phenomenon, having to do, I think, with the conjuncture of neoliberal globalization. You do find Marxists present in certain international relations departments, at least in, I won't speak for the global south, but at least in Europe and North America. I'm thinking especially of Sussex University, King's College in London, my own university, York University in Toronto. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves is it such a great accomplishment that you find Marxists teaching international relations at the university? Emanuel Wallerstein once came to York University in Toronto. At the time that he was overseeing a big study for the Gulbenkian Foundation on the explosion of disciplines and sub-disciplines in academic life in the second half of the 20th century. You know, from the main core disciplines, anthropology, sociology, economics, and so on. Political science, it had been famously said, has never found its object of study. This may still be true. The theme of Wallerstein's study was that we have made a Tower of Babel of the social sciences. And when he was finished, an anthropologist in the sociology department at York got out, an expert on Egypt, and said, you know, you named every variety of the study of the social sciences, but you didn't mention Marxism once. And Wallerstein said, well, until the 1960s, if you were a Marxist, you went into a revolutionary party. It was only with the explosion of academic life that Marxists ended up in universities, and the implication was that you see the consequences of this. And I'm sure people sitting in the room felt very defensive. Here we are, stuck in the university as Marxists rather than making a revolution, rather than changing. I'm not sure that now looking back on it, that we should have felt so defensive. You know, given the inability of communist parties and social democratic parties to allow for, to encourage, to develop serious inquiry into the changing nature of capitalism and the changing nature of relations of states in capitalism. given that, I'm not sure it hasn't been a good thing that so many Marxists were able to escape the stifling intellectual, or really non-intellectual environment in the political parties. The types of parties, after all, that produced the great Marxist classics, from Luxemburg to Lenin to Gramsci, etc. They weren't producing them anymore in the party. In that sense, I don't think there was anything necessarily to be defensive about. In fact, I think it's been, to some extent, fortunate that we've had the space, and who knows how much longer we will have it, but that we've had the space to try to make Marxism better, even in the university arena, in terms of understanding the nature of the world. That's by way of introduction. Let me try to provide some historical background before coming to the current conjuncture on the relationship between international relations and Marxism. To some extent, the discipline or the sub-discipline of international relations as we know it comes out almost in opposition to Marxism. It comes out, it's created in opposition to the great classical theories of imperialism that are generated out of Marxist inquiry in the run-up to World War I. And the discipline of international relations is partly designed to counter that theory of imperialism and to, insofar as it's located most strongly in the United States and the United Kingdom, even in the post-World War I era, it's oriented towards defining the world in terms of Woodrow Wilson's March of Democracy, emanating from the imperial countries of the United States, the liberal imperial countries of England and the United States. Of course, the ontology of international relations is a very old one, and it is a state-centric ontology. It's ahistorical insofar as it treats the world historically as a matter of conflicts between great powers. Reinforced in the 20th century by looking back at the era of Westphalia, of the creation of nation states, with the balance of power established between them in the 19th century. And it's a bit of a theory that I like to call the billiard ball theory of the world. I asked for the translation of this. It's Mesa snooker, right? International relations essentially treats, its theory is, here are these balls interacting with one another on this field, right? And insofar as there is an agent in this, it is the agent that is wielding the stick, yes? And that agent is usually geostrategic elites inside the state. Yes. In that sense, that if there is a causative agent, and you get this very much in the core of realism and neo-realism in international relations, the causative agent is really seen in quite an idealist way. It's what's in the heads of the people who are wielding the stick. Yes? Their approach to the world, their strategic orientation in snookering. Yes? One ball against another. Marxism, of course, is much more interested in what are the physical compositions of the billiard balls. What is the structure of the table? Yes? Even is it tilted one way or the other? That is, it looks inside the states to understand, first of all, how the dynamics of capital accumulation and the contradictions of capital accumulation are determining in the relationship between states, and secondly, understanding the class forces that were inside each of the nation states as also determining, although one has to say that traditionally Marxism also has a very instrumental notion of the state very often, classically. That is, it is the bourgeoisie that wields the state, right? That wields the billiard state. yes, as if it has in its head knowledge of what's in its interest in an absolute way. Yes. And you see this weakness of Marxism, even in the classical theory of imperialism, which has a very instrumental view of the state. Its great understanding, of course, was that what distinguishes modern imperialism from the traditional imperialisms of the pre-capitalist era is the movement of capital, rather necessarily than merely territorial conquest. But it understands that movement of capital in a very reductive way in relation to a thesis that already by the beginning of the 20th century, capitalism had overaccumulated to the point within each of the nations, the imperial nation states, where it had established itself, that it was forced thereby into capturing colonies around the world. And secondly, increasingly forced into, partly for the colony reasons, and partly for reasons having to do with competition over a limited arena of surplus given overaccumulation, the buildup of military apparatuses. And who is wielding the stick in this theory is increasingly a highly concentrated banking capital, which has overtaken industry, the thesis of finance capital. That theory, while it certainly had much in it to help explain the conjuncture of World War I, the breakup of the first globalization that developed in the 19th century, its defects were patent. The assumption that capitalism in the advanced countries had reached its limits of accumulation at the beginning of the 20th century now can be seen to be absurd. Indeed, the extent to which the surplus, the profits are realized in the domestic working classes through sales of commodities to the domestic working classes of the imperial country was something that was just barely visible at that time, as trade unions and mass socialist parties were just emerging and winning for workers in those countries the kind of forced income that allowed them to be consumed, which helped overcome crises of accumulation. And the instrumentalist understanding of the state involved an assumption that all states, that capitalism was necessarily composed of capitalist nation states. As Hannes Lacher, my colleague at the University of York in Toronto, has shown, through the 19th century, it was largely still pre-capitalist states. For reasons to do with military competition with Britain that were crucial to the encouragement, development, facilitation of capitalism inside their societies, and then over time, their own institution became more and more capitalist. And as Schumpeter said in relation to the causes of World War I, a crucially important factor in the militarization were the continuing remnants of feudal elements inside those states. Feudal elements which have been based on military, territorial conquest, etc. In any case, whatever one says about the conjunctural relevance of that classical theory of imperialism in 1914, the notion that we were seeing capitalism's final stage, or indeed Kautsky's notion that we might see after World War I a condominium of imperial states rather than rivalry between them. Both of those proved not to be the case by the time of World War II. The enormous dynamism of not only American capitalism, but even capitalism under the fascist states in the 1930s, I think undermined any notion of a final stage even before the post-World War II era. But beyond that, of course, Kautsky's notion of a condominium amongst the imperial states, of an equal relationship between them, was exploded by the conflicts that led to it. In the post-war era, one saw a reconstruction both of international relations and of Marxism, in quite fundamental ways. International relations oriented itself to understand the way in which, as Marxists saw it, the American imperial state managed to penetrate and incorporate within its empire the European imperial states of the pre-World War I era. And it called that, of course, hegemonic stability theory, liberal internationalism, and it was associated with development theory, the spread of democracy. An example for the world was being established whereby all states in the world would eventually become bourgeois liberal capitalist states along the lines of the United States. The emergence of international political economy as a sub-discipline of international relations in the 1970s, which does give it finally a bit of a serious political economy foundation for the first time, you have to remember emerges explicitly in the context of liberals and social democrats being worried after the breakdown of Bretton Woods that Nixon is undermining the institutions and practices of hegemonic stability. And all of the theory is oriented to carrying policy to Washington, to convince Washington that they should not go back to the 1930s, that they should continue with liberal internationalism, hegemonic stability. That's the roots of IPP. In the Marxist tradition, in the post-war era, imperialism does remain in some senses the core concept. Insofar as Marxism makes its running in the 20th century, it makes it around the concept of imperialism more than anything else. Insofar as it has any lasting legs, it makes it around the concept of imperialism, but it does so by entirely switching its focus. The classical theory about how do we explain inter-imperial rivalry, how do we explain the rivalry amongst the most advanced capitalist countries? What the Marxist theory becomes is a theory of the center-periphery relationship, a unified core, a unified capitalist core, which is engaged in a process of reproducing domination and dependency and global uneven development at a world level. That becomes the transformation of Marxism in the post-war period. Whereas the classical theory, therefore, had taken into account the relationship between individual imperial countries and their colonies. The core now became a unified core in relation to a peripheral capitalist world. Secondly, insofar as there was a degree of rivalry continuing in the post-war order, IR theory tended to transpose that to understand the Cold War between the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire, if you like, and those core capitalist countries, and their competition and dominance over the countries of the global south, of the periphery. By the 1970s, Beverly Silver's brilliant life partner and co-author, co-researcher Giovanni Arrighi, already in his brilliant book, The Geometry of Imperialism, identified the Tower of Babel that we have made out of the theory of imperialism. was no longer related to, in any significant way, to the theory of overaccumulation. It had not maintained any sensible relationship to the notion of inter-imperial rivalry, etc. And in the wake of that criticism, sorry. Oh, yeah, okay. In the wake of that criticism, I think it's fair to say that the kind of work that was being done here in Brazil, which I was only introduced to some 20 years ago, I have to admit, by Marini, was much qualifying. I mean, I think had Giovanni had paid more attention to Marini's theory, he would have seen that there was there, in Marini's understanding of the way in which there was a transformation of social relations going on in the global south, in the context of the core-periphery relationship, while being structured still in terms of a relationship of dominance. I think he wouldn't have been as bleak in his examination of the studies of imperialism at that time. In any case, one finally also saw the entry of a Marxian analysis into international relations through international political economy, but one that did not use the notion of imperialism. Very notable. And that was, of course, Gramscian international political economy, with my colleague at York, Robert Cox, in many ways as the lead author of this. But this was an attempt to understand international political economy through production relations at a global level, yes? With a notion of ideological hegemony at its core, rather than the notion of imperialism, which hardly made any entry into so you begin to see the transformation of those fields. The discourse of globalization affects both international relations and Marxism profoundly by the mid-1980s onward. I say the discourse of globalization because, of course, the phenomenon of what's called globalization doesn't begin in the 1980s. It begins, if you like, in the 19th century and through the course of the 20th century, but even in the post-war period, especially with the movement of American multinationals, not only to the Third World, but to Europe, one sees the roots of what is today called globalization long before the term becomes much used. Some people see it early. The Weberian Raymond Aron in France, the Marxist Nikos Poulantzas begin to speak already in the late 1960s of the Canadianization of Europe. And they mean thereby the movement of American capital to become a social force inside the European social formations. But the discourse of globalization has a big effect, both on international relations and on Marxism. The theory of Westphalia is challenged, and instead you finally get some historical element introduced into international relations. You see now the period of modernity has passed, the period of nation states engaged in a billiard ball relationship to one another has passed, and you get markets bypassing states. But in a typical way of international relations, the understanding of markets is unbelievably thin. Unbelievably thin. Very little understanding of what are the internal dynamics that compose those markets, either in terms of class relations or the dynamics of capital accumulation, etc. But the notion is that markets are bypassing states. And, you know, as Justin Rosenberg has so wonderfully shown, really this was a theory without an explanation. You begin with a list of empirical factors that show how much. So it's too loud now. Okay.
No, slow down a bit for translation.
I'm trying to stay within by 40 minutes. you get a list of empirical factors which show the internationalization of markets. And then that is used, right, to explain all the empirical factors that indicate the internationalization of markets and the like that. In Marxism, you get a shift from the Coxian, Gramscian international political economy towards what is now more prominent in sociology than in international relations, but it's there as well. The notion that a transnational capitalist class has emerged, which also bypasses nation states, right, and is in the process of creating a transnational state, yes, of which the United States its institutional apparatus is a part, you know, as are the international organizations of the world, etc. And there is this transnational bourgeoisie, which then is the agent of globalization, transcendent. It's not merely abstract. Both of these developments are a continuing reflection of it's astonishing, really, a continuing reflection of the weakness of any theory of the state, both in Marxism and in international relations. And I would argue that the breakthrough that occurred in terms of the development of a Marxist theory of the state in the late 1960s and 1970s, with its entry into comparative politics, is precisely what needs to be, and to some extent has been, finally happened in understanding international relations from a Marxist perspective at the turn of the millennium, in the 1990s, the first decade of the 21st century. As I have argued before, the requisites of a serious Marxist theory of the state, which is open to comparison, to historical variation, is not merely abstractly functionalist, first has to begin by a serious historical determination, description of what are the institutions of any given state, making a clear distinction between liberal states and authoritarian states, democratic states and fascist states, but also much more than that, trying to understand the importance of the federal nature of states, etc. Secondly, and this is of course the central idea in the new Marxist theory of the state, there needs to be a very careful examination of the relative autonomy that states have from the dominant classes, from capitalist classes. An examination, an analysis, not a presumption that there is a high degree of relative autonomy. In Brazil, there's never been very much relative autonomy. You've seen this around you today, right? In other states, there has. And why that's important, and you will have to look at it in relation to each of the state institutions, as well as the totality of them. And why it's especially important is that it helps you understand how the functions of capitalist states are carried out. Those functions being, how does the state facilitate and reproduce capital accumulation? How does it legitimate class relations, exploitative, dominated class relations? And to what extent is coercion necessary when either accumulation or legitimation are not functioning very well? That's the core of what is necessary in terms of a serious theory of the state, both for Marxism and for international. Now, if we turn to Marxism and international relations today, I think the key concept that we need to work with, and I've argued this in my own work, is the concept of the internationalization of the state. And you can already see this term used by Poulantzas, by Cox, but we need to develop it much, much more than they did. We need to understand it not in terms of what capitalism is leading to in the 21st century is a transnational state, which bypasses nation states. On the contrary, we need to be examining the extent to which certain states, for reasons that need to be explained through historical materials analysis, acquire the responsibility, the interest and the responsibility to be engaged in facilitating accumulation, legitimation, and coercion on a transnational scale beyond their own borders. And they come to do so, of course, in the 20th century, largely through, and this is the great American example, not of territorial management, but of informal empire. That is, they do not challenge territorial sovereignty in undertaking this managerial coordinating function for a global, for an increasingly transnational accumulation process. Indeed, the types of coordination that they undertake is precisely premised on territorial sovereignty, not challenging. Very important in this is to what extent are states restructured, either by coercion or invitation, in such a way that they too, even if they're not in the core, become responsible for taking into consideration the transnational conditions of capital accumulation in their own institutional makeup. So when a policy is introduced, whether it's austerity or fiscal stimulus, whatever, one never needs to only look at it in terms of that being done by a finance ministry in relation to the Brazilian economy or the Canadian economy alone. It's undertaken with an eye to its effects on and what contradictions it might introduce into managing the global economy. Now, some states do this much more than others. This is the central concern of the American Federal Reserve and Treasury. This is the central concern of many of the European central banks, let alone the ECB itself. And in some respects, one could say, as I've argued, that those state institutions, which are much more closely related to facilitating and managing the contradictions of global capital accumulation, are more important than the coercive military apparatuses that we usually think about as the core imperialist apparatuses in classical Marxist theory or in IR theory. The key questions today, in the current conjuncture, it seems to me, are the following three. I mean, intellectual questions. What is the problematic of the practice of Marxism in international relations today? What is the central problematique that we need to be examining? One of them, and I'll start with this because we're in Brazil, is precisely the question of whether we are seeing with the dynamic capitalisms that developed in the global south, in certain very large countries of the global south, what we are seeing is the emergence in the global south of either singularly or in conjunction with one another, a new shift of accumulation, of the center of accumulation, to certain countries in the global south. This would be the theory of the BRICS, or indeed Giovanni's notion that we are seeing a shift of the center of global accumulation to East Asia, above all to China, after the slowing down of Japanese capitalist dynamic. Then, you know, the kind of studies, analyses that are normally done in this respect are usually very positivist and empiricist. That is, they simply project trends of rates of growth of various measures and say, aha, you see, China is catching up or Brazil is catching up, etc. Not examining at all the internal contradiction within, let us say, each of the BRICS. And here I have to pay great tribute to the people in Brazil who are working on developing Marini's theory of the sub-imperialism. Because I was here 3 years ago for a conference on imperialism in this respect, and I think you're doing the richest work in this regard, almost anyone, in terms of understanding the way in which, indeed, Brazil is being pulled into and playing a role as a state in facilitating its own multinational, international. Indeed, this very week, Brazil has joined the Paris Club. People know what the Paris Club is? It's presented in the bourgeois press as an association that's existed since 1976 among certain countries to provide debt relief to highly indebted third world countries. It's actually not that, it's a debt collection agency rather than a debt relief agency. And it goes all the way back to the coordination that was done in the 19th century through gunboat diplomacy against those states which couldn't pay the bonds that they had issued, usually in London or in Paris. But this is a much more civilized process, of course, and for the first time, just last week, South Korea and Brazil were added to this club of Paris because of their interest, not least Brazil's interest, in the question of whether countries in Africa, to which Brazil has lent a lot of money, will be able ever to repay the debts on those bonds. So you see, it's not only a matter of a shift from the G7 to the G20. You see it in all kinds of interesting arenas. Nevertheless, one also sees, and this is the central question, it seems to me, and I'm dying to hear from you this week what your analysis is. Whether what is happening in countries like South Africa, India, China, but above all Brazil today, with the scandals, the hollowing out to some extent, not only of the PT, but the BNDES, the state corporation that has played such a key role in facilitating a Brazilian sub-imperialism. What are the implications of it? Does this mean that this was a temporary phenomenon? That this role of the Brazilian state is being hollowed out and undermined? That seems to me a central problem in two things. Second, the question of will there be the emergence of a global state, which I always think has been a rather overblown and insupportable idea, although it's very, very popular in the United States, especially with Marxist sociology. And here it seems to me the test of this is now the crisis of the European Union. If there ever was an example of an international state apparatus, a transnational state apparatus, that looked like it indeed was going to be able to absorb within it the nation states to which belonged to it, it was the European Union. And what we are seeing before us today is the enormous crisis of the European Union. The center of gravity since the 2007-2008 financial crisis, and especially the crisis of the euro since 2009-2010, has very clearly shown to not lay in Brussels, but to lay in each of the individual nation states of Europe, with the balance of class forces in each of those states being determining of what happens in Europe. And of course, that balance of class forces is very asymmetrical depending on the nation state. What really matters is the balance of class forces in Germany, insofar as there is an international determination of what happens in Spain or Brazil, etc. It's not the international state apparatus in Brussels that is proved to be determined. One sees in this context something that looks very much like the old gunboat diplomacy. The ECB, together with the European Union and the IMF, have emplaced in Greece what the United States emplaced in Nicaragua when it didn't pay its debts at the beginning of the 20th century. They have actual personnel sitting in the key state departments, determining whether the priority will be to repay the debts or to provide welfare to those We're unemployed in Greece, 50% of the youth, 25% general unemployment. With the rise of the right, because of the hollowing out of the social democratic left, and indeed even of the communist left. The Italian Communist Party is now to the right of the American Democratic Party. With that hollowing out, you've seen some instances of a rise of new parties, I'll just mention that at the end. You see a direct and increasing working class support for a nationalist, xenophobic right in Europe. And the big question, we don't know the answer to this yet, is whether this is the type of right which will want to dissolve the European Union as an arena of economic and monetary union. Even if they want to, will they be able to? Is there a bourgeoisie any longer in Germany or in France or in Italy or indeed even in Spain, which is not trying to accumulate on a transnational scale, which is happy to return, as the fascists did, to a notion of territorial expansion, opening the way to accumulation? That's a very dubious question. So this is, I think, what lies before us in terms of what we need to study. And then finally, there is this perennial question of the decline of the American Empire, which is repeated so often one almost wants to dismiss it now when one hears it. But it's a serious question. I think it does need to be examined. And here both realists and Marxists come together. Both of them are always trying to explain or predict the decline of the empire. They have a very different practice. The realists do it in order to scare Washington to change their policy so that America can remain dominant. The Marxists do it in the hope that if the American empire falls apart, we can suddenly somehow magically have socialism. And constantly are using the theory of the tendency of the falling rate of profit to fall to explain why you will have this decline of the empire that won't be able to hold global capitalism. It seems to me, and it's always seemed to me, that insofar as the United States is not able to continue its coordinating role, which one has to remember it did quite remarkably after the 2007-8 crisis with the G20. First by promoting a unified stimulus in 2009-10, which prevented the world going into the equivalent of the 1930s depression, and then by coordinating with the G20, a universal austerity program, a reinforcement of neoliberalism. But it's always been the internal contradictions and indeed the political contradictions internally that have made the practice of this type of coordination difficult in the United States. One forgets that it was much easier to get NAFTA through Mexico and Canada than it was to get NAFTA through the United States. That's where it was most difficult to pass that legislation. One forgets that Reagan came to power promising that he would introduce tariffs against everybody. And one of the reasons that Mexican and Canadian capital and state officials wanted NAFTA was they wanted to get inside what they feared would be a Reagan policy of high tariffs for the rest of the world. One has seen repeatedly inside the American political apparatus an expression of class conflict that has taken the form of a demand that globalization be halted, and a resentment and not a deep understanding of the imperial role of the American state, of when the Federal Reserve does quantitative easing, when it throws money into the system. It doesn't only do it to keep the American banking system going. Indeed, as IMF officials have said, it did it more importantly to keep European banks going, so that the New York banks would continue to lend overnight to the French banks, so that they would keep going. That's never been understood. It's been hidden usually by the American state itself, even from its own population. And you begin to see the contradictions of this, of course, in the Trump phenomenon I just Where that will go, who knows? I'm convinced what it represents, as with Reagan, who also, after all, promised tariffs while promoting globalization in the end, is that it will lead to the repression and closure of political space for the left. Not only discursively, but coercively, I think. Some of the things we've been seeing going on in Hungary and Poland with the xenophobic right, I think we're going to see in the heart of the empire itself. The extent to which we will see a retreat from facilitating global capital accumulation and trade, I'm more dubious about. I think there will be some superficial tariffs imposed. You know, one of Trump's great supporters are the bikers for America. Maybe he will introduce a tariff on motorcycles. But I don't think it's unlikely, because of the importance of NFCs to the American economy, because of Trump's own interest in capital flows and open capital flows with his golf courses and hotels around the world, etc., that we will see this. But we are likely to see this type of continued capital flow being associated with criminal capital, with the type of things that you know very well in Brazil, in terms of the kinds of shady deals between states and corporations that we've seen here. I think we're going to see more of that. There's always been some. We're going to see more of that coming from the United States. Finally, in terms of practices, and I want to come back to Marxism in the university. In this conjuncture, when, as we've seen with Syriza in Greece, there is a shift from protest to politics, when, as we've seen in the case of Britain with the Corbyn phenomenon in the Labour Party, or Sanders in the Democratic Party, when there's a shift from protest to politics, an understanding that you can't change the world without taking power, that you can protest until hell freezes over and you won't change the world. You need to go into the state as part of transforming. As you see from Syriza in Greece, they took power, explicitly saying it would be, now that we have the opportunity, it would be the grossest irresponsibility not to stop the bleeding. And then they get trapped inside the clientelist, patronage-ridden Greek state. Right? And even worse, get trapped within the institutions of the European Union, which they are not ready to break with, for understandable reasons. Well, the role that we need to be playing in this problem the left has in temporalities, it's very important that we get into the state, at least for defensive reasons, given the rise of the right, given the reinforcement of neoliberalism. And yet, we need decades, as the PT learned to its cost, we need decades to prepare ourselves to develop the capacities for changing the institutions of the state, so they aren't capitalist institutions, so they aren't oriented to reproducing accumulation, domination, and coercion. We don't know how to do this. The parties don't know how to do it. And we have this terrible divorce of temporalities at the moment. We need more time to develop the capacities to prepare for alternate types of production, for alternate types of consumption, and yet we need to get into the state quickly. Well, the role, I think, that Marxists in international relations and elsewhere in the academia can play is indeed to spend a lot of time trying to think seriously about what it would take to transform state institutions when one gets into the state, so that they can be agencies of transformation rather than agencies of reproduction or coercion.
Queria registrar a presença do professor Manuel Santana, diretor do Instituto de Filosofia e Ciências Sociais da UFRJ. Passo agora a palavra à professora Beverly Silver. Uma questão logística, você consegue filmá-la aí? Não.
Tá bom aqui, sim. Ela tá me vendo.
Thank you very much. I wanted to thank the organizers for the invitation to come here. It's always extremely interesting to come to Brazil and to speak with people here in Brazil. I always learn a lot. And I must say, a few months ago, I was watching events in Brazil from afar in the United States and wondering, I couldn't, shake my head what's going on, and then, but then of course I was watching events in the United States from close up and equally shaking my head. So I think there's different forms of solidarity. So we have a particular form of solidarity in living through what the Chinese call interesting times. So let me just start. I'm going to start with two quotes to begin to try and locate the moment in world history that we're in, to try and understand what period of world history we're in right now. And one quote is from 1915 from Rosa Luxemburg, which I'll show next. So that's, of course, in the midst of the First World War. And the quote that I have up now is from Antonio Gramsci written in Mussolini's prison, and it's from 1930, so at the moment where there's the rise of fascist movements and governments in Europe and around the world. And so this quote, here we go. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So this is the Gramsci quote. The next slide. Oh, there we go. So I think, again, none of us necessarily need a list of morbid symptoms. I think we can all come up with plenty of examples ourselves, but I just put these two up: wars without end and refugee crisis, and the rise of fascist, racist, authoritarian movements and governments in the center. So when I try, one way to think about this question of the dying of the old and the failure yet of the new to emerge is to use Giovanni Arrighi's systemic cycles of accumulation model, and I'm putting this up just as a reminder to people of the conceptualization he uses in the long 20th century which sees historical capitalism as being characterized by a series of overlapping S-curves, long centuries that are overlapping, and that the period of overlap is a period of crisis, of hegemonic transition. It's been historically, in each of the previous long centuries, it's been a long period of systemic chaos from one long century to the next. And I stuck, so I stuck, we are at 3B here. So in some sense, what in IRID's formulation, 3A would have been the signal crisis of the long 20th century, so the 1960s and 70s, this period in between the Belle Epoque and the terminal crisis, and I'll get back to Leo's comments in a minute, but in a sense we're 3B. So we're in this moment where the long 20th century, the US systemic cycle of accumulation is coming to an end, and something new is emerging, but it's also a period that in past transitions has been a long period of war and systemic chaos and deep human suffering. So, this is a quote from Luxembourg, which is the famous bourgeois society stands at the crossroads, either the transition to socialism or the regression into barbarism. So that she's writing in 1915 with the outbreak of the First World War. I stuck up the whole quote because normally we don't see the whole quote, but she's referring to war, unlimited war, and then she's saying that the only compensation for all the misery and all the shame would be if we learn something from this moment of crisis about, well, anyway, the language is a bit anachronistic, but how the proletariat conceives of the lackey to the ruling classes. But however we want to formulate it now, I put, partly I do think that we're in this moment of a crossroads in world history, and in the history of capitalism, the history of humanity. But I think there's also the question, very importantly, of what we can learn in this moment. I'm starting from, thank you, Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System, which was published in 1999. So it was written at the height of the United States Belle Epoque. It was written at the moment where the U.S. was the sole superpower, where financialization had restored the United States power on a world scale, where there was really, in the U.S. and around the world, the sense of no possible challenge. So the premise of the book was, though, that this Belle Epoque was temporary. This period of hegemonic stability was temporary, and that what we were seeing was a temporary reflation of United States power, but that would eventually come again into crisis. So our premise in 1999, when we were writing, was that all previous long centuries had ended in a long period of systemic chaos and human suffering, but this was not inevitable. So it was a characteristic of all past transitions, but it was not something that was inevitable. It was something that if we studied past hegemonic transitions, that we might be able to see something about the mechanisms that led from crisis to systemic chaos, and that it's not that one would, there was a capacity to limit the amount of suffering or the length of the systemic chaos. So from the long from Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System, the conclusion ends with two lessons, which I put up from the Portuguese. We can go to the next. I'm sorry, all the accent marks are missing because I didn't have the accents on my keyboard. I happen to have the Portuguese edition, but hopefully it's better than nothing. But so today, so the first lesson was this idea that the declining hegemonic power had to adjust, or the established hegemonic power, meaning the United States, had to adjust to the rising economic power, and here we're referring particularly to East Asia, but in general the rising economic power of others. So the argument here was that if you looked at the transition from British to US hegemony, if you looked at the first half of the 20th century, that part of the reason why the systemic chaos was so long and so deep was because Britain resisted the rise, the changing balance of power in the world. So think, for example, Keynes, John Maynard Keynes' critique in The Economic Consequences of Peace, or something, that the fact that, other, including Marxist theorists, that think of that the idea that Britain hung on tightly to its empire, and as a result contributed to the length and depth of the crisis. The second lesson from the comparison, so on the one hand, we said that a necessary condition for limiting the length and depth of the crisis and the systemic chaos was the United States needed to adjust to its decline gracefully. The second was that whether it's movements or states, here we pose it as states, needed to supply a systemic solution to the problems that were left behind by U.S. hegemony. And the most severe of these is the great gulf between the life chances of a small minority of the world's population and the vast majority. So needed to deal with the question of inequality, both inequality and livelihood. So this is in 1999, so getting close to 20 years ago, and we were saying a long period of systemic chaos is not inevitable, it's avoidable, but in order to avoid it, certain things need to be done, okay? And then there's the question of, so it was a theory of human agency, contingency, but as it turns out, either the contingency theory is wrong or humans are, incorrigible. But if we look at what happened from the Belle Epoque in the 1990s, so when if we look at what happened over the last 20 years, essentially the opposite of what was recommended has been done. So start from the signal crisis of U.S. hegemony in the 1960s and 70s, which had different manifestations, including challenges from the third world. Leo had already referred to Nixon and the abandonment of the dollar gold standard. The response was the financialization and Belle Epoque. So there was a counter-revolution, Reagan-Thatcher counter-revolution, which changed temporarily the balance of class forces. And then what we get so again, this is like the opposite of adjustment. But then here too, when we get to from 2003 to 2016, that essentially everything that was done was the opposite. So in response to September 11th, we get the Project for a New American Century 1.0, I say. With the Trump election, I think we're going to get the Project for a New American Century 2.0. I don't think, again, this language of isolationism, I don't think is what we're actually going to get. And again, rather than adjusting and finding a solution to the livelihood questions that were already evident and the growing inequality that was already evident in the 1990s, instead we ended up with deepening inequality within countries and class inequality over the last 10, 15 years. So back to this picture. if Luxembourg and Gramsci were writing here, we're here, and the question is, what can we understand about what might be emerging here in terms of some new global dynamic or world order. So the next slide, where are we headed? So in comparison to when we were writing in 1999, and the argument was, let's avoid the fall into a long and deep period of systemic chaos. Today, I think we're in the period of systemic chaos, so we need to switch our thinking and say, okay, we're in this period of systemic chaos. It requires a particular kind of thinking about what are the tasks, or the kind of things that Leo was ending in, which are both immediate tasks and then long-term tasks. And then the question is, and that relates to then how do we minimize the length and depth of the chaos and human suffering. I wanted to, in doing this, I just wanted to make a quick point about IRID's theory of systemic cycles of accumulation, because it's often been misread or misunderstood as a cyclical theory. In part, that's because, of course, the overlapping S-curves are a cycle, and there is a cyclical aspect to the theory. But he was very clear that what he was developing theoretically was an evolutionary view of capitalism rather than a predominantly cyclical view. So that, again, even though every long century ended with a financial expansion, that each of these financial expansions had been periods of fundamental reorganization of the world system, in which the governmental business complex increased in size, power, and complexity, including social complexity. So the social complexity question is something very important that we'll come back to. So here's this, just again, you know, I have a note to myself, show for one second to point to cycles. That second is up. Okay, so a better way to think about where we've been and where we're headed, or to think about historical capitalism, is to think about it as a spiral. So that in each of these turns of the spiral is a long century, where in some sense one returns, but one's returning to a system that's fundamentally reorganized and different, so that it matters, again, that that in the 20th century you have capitalism without formal colonies. In the 19th century, in Brazil, by the end of the 19th century, in the US gets there about 15 years earlier, is a capitalism without slavery, without mass formal slavery, etc. So you get reorganizations of capitalism, both socially, in terms of business enterprise, in terms of class relations, you know, so you have a cycle, but it's not simply a return of the same. Here's another image of a spiral, which gives the sense not only of evolutionary process, but an evolutionary process on an enlarging scale. So again, over the history of capitalism, we have an enlargement of in each cycle of expanded globalization and incorporation. And what I can't get, and I don't know, maybe somebody can think of what the picture would be that would capture the qualitative transformation in each of the cycles, or also the complexity. So how you get complexity, the idea of growing complexity into the spiral. But, so what I want to now talk about is what more specifically we can learn or about the present or understand about the present from these comparisons with the past. And one thing that I want to say is that in some sense that this question of the the two points that we wrote about in 1999, when I think about it, they were written with the idea of avoiding the fall into systemic chaos, but they're also something that still needs to be resolved in terms of shortening or the length of the systemic chaos. Anyway, this is, and again, Leo referred to it as one of his three questions in the end, is this question of the geographical, whether there's a shift in the geographical center of capital accumulation. This is a quote from the section on primitive accumulation in Volume 1 of Capital. And here, Marx is already noting in embryonic form the role of finance capital in shifting the center of capital accumulation over different historical epochs, so from southern Italy to Holland, from Holland to the United Kingdom, from England to the United States, and of course now we have the role also of finance accumulation, the question of the role of the BRICS and that question. So what I wanted to do, the important thing to note here is that when we're talking about the shift in the center of accumulation, and I'm going to show some data in a second, that it's not the same shift as from southern Italy to Holland to England to the United States, but there's something fundamentally different, which means that we're not, again, when we're looking at the overlap curves, this difference is important in thinking that we're just going to restart another systemic cycle of accumulation. And one way to show that, I've got some data here. This is a study we've been doing at the IRID Center, where we've taken Agnes Madison's data on gross national income per capita from 1500. This is 2008. So on the y-axis is the percentage of the world population at any particular income level, and the x-axis is the log of gross national income per capita this is PPP data. I'm going to show you non-PPP data in a minute for the last couple of years, because this picture looks a little bit different without if you use FX data, exchange rate data. But in any case, so what we did and what came out, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the details, except something interesting came out in the sense that in the 16th and 17th, 18th century, you have pretty much a unimodal distribution where of course there's a variation in wealth or income levels, but there's not a great divergence. You start to see the great divergence and the emergence of a core by the mid-late 19th century. What's interesting is by the mid-20th century, you see very clear emergence of a middle income group. So like if you take 1950, this would be the US would be the small percentage of the world population at a high level of income. That if you take the largest mode here to the left, it would be a peripheral mode, where India, China, most of sub-Saharan Africa would be by 1950 and throughout really the long 20th century. This, interestingly enough, this picture of a core, periphery, semi-periphery, tripartite structure seems to be very strong. So we go in the period of British hegemony, domination, whatever you want. Imperialism would be a different. Anyway, we'll get to the Tower of Babel later, and let me just bimodal, trimodal. And then something is starting to happen here, precisely in this period that we say is a period of crisis and transformation, and that is the breakup of the periphery. So 1990, you still very clearly a peripheral mode with China and India separate and much lower than where Brazil, South and Eastern Europe is, or much less where the core is. And by here, it starts by 2008. China, this is the PPP data, China has merged into the semi-peripheral mode. India is here, and then there's countries that are left behind, but there's still the core. Now, there's still this small percentage of the world population that's way ahead in wealth and in the core. Now, the important thing to note, one important thing I wanted to note here, these transformations always have to do with the breakup of the peripheral mode, the dividing up of the peripheral mode. They're never, none of these transformations, even though they keep bringing about a return of modernization theory, none of them actually empirically support modernization theory, because always this core mode is left, it's not a catching up with the core mode, it's parts of the periphery catching up with the middle mode. I'm just going to quickly show this. There's some missing data here. It should be a little bit higher. This is 1990. Again, the trimodal. That if there wasn't missing data, that'd be a little bit higher. This is the exchange rate data, not the. And then this is next one is 2008 again. So you see there's a big transformation in the. But again, it's not a transformation that's catching up with the U.S. or Western Europe, but it is a significant transformation of global inequality. So this gets back to so let me leave it at as part of what we're experiencing is turbulence now. Part of that turbulence is a significant shift in the global distribution of income and wealth, but exactly how to interpret it will come back to toward the end. So that's inequality between countries, okay? At least economic inequality between countries. Now, I wanted to shift to the question of inequality within countries. So one thing, again, that characterized all previous periods of systemic chaos was the breakdown of established social compacts. So when I use hegemony, I'm using it in the Gramscian sense of a combination of consent and coercion. So it's consent directed at your class allies and coercion at the class and national enemies. And so one thing that's happened over, that we see, again, as part of this recurrence and transformation, is a breakdown in the periods of financialization of established class compacts. So financialization proceeding through a regressive redistribution of wealth, leading to growing inequality and livelihood crisis of legitimacy for capitalism, Polanyi's double movement. What I would say is we can use this as a schematic story of the early 20th century and a schematic story of the early 21st century, where then we get, Polanyi's double movement, we're getting it again, this outcome here. This is the data this is actually from Piketty, but it shows the percentage of income going to the top 10% in the United States from 1917 to 2008. So again, what we have is periods of extreme inequality in the early 20th century and in the late 20th century, and this period of growing, lessening inequality. And if the data, again, this is this question of what's happened post-2008. If we had the data it would, continue up here. Right. So the undermining, this gets back to the question of the crisis of legitimacy for capitalism. Let me just show the data for, this is the same thing, 1918 to 2005, and again, if we had the data going on, it would go further up, and that's the inequality data for Britain. Yeah, that's just the same thing. Let me move on. So I don't think I have time to talk about this, but another way to think about this, the dynamic that I'm talking about here between the systemic chaos and the social inequality is to think of capitalism as being characterized by a fundamental tension between profitability and legitimacy, okay? And so this is a picture for the 20th century where we see the crisis of profitability being overcome through a redistribution of wealth, producing a crisis of legitimacy, being overcome, if it's overcome or tampered down, by a move toward redistribution, toward labor, which puts a crisis of profitability. So this is going 1870s, 1930s, 1960s, 1970s, 2000s, okay? And it's showing a shift back and forth between what's a fundamentally a crisis of profitability and fundamentally a crisis of legitimacy. So where we end up here, this is, in the 2000s, 2001, 2008, and on into 2016, it's a deepening crisis of legitimacy. Okay, I should have changed. Never mind. I can talk about that later. And if it's going to be resolved, there has to be some shift back. One would have thought that the 2008 crisis would have led to some intelligent elites preempting and actually doing some policies that redistributed wealth, but instead, since 2008, pretty much everywhere we've had an increase in inequality. And anyway, where Brazil fits in has its own pattern, but certainly is now heading very much on that pattern again. So what's likely to shape the direction into the future? I'm going to talk a little bit now about the long-term pattern of global social protest. Let me just say, the global social protest has always played a key role in driving the evolution of the world capitalist system. And I say global social protest, what I just mean is local social protests added up globally. And so if we go back to thinking about the spirals, right, that the Haitian Revolution, slave revolts were critical in shaping the way that British hegemony comes out, that labor movements, socialist movements, national liberation movements are critical in shaping the way that the 20th century capitalism evolves, and that also as we look into the future, the movements will play a critical role in shaping what comes out in the 21st century. So this is the number of reports of labor unrest in the world, 1970 to 1996. And the interesting things here, this is the period from World War I through World War II. We see like a rising and explosive pattern of labor unrest. And this is the US-led financial expansion. This is the UK-led financial expansion. One interesting thing that we did we stopped collecting the data in 1996. But it's not because there was any theory of an end of history. It was just a theory. It was just not even a theory. It was a practical problem of going through all the newspapers and coming up with very little. So at the same time, we were saying as soon as we see things happening, that we should start collecting the data again. And in 2010, I was on an airplane and handed a free copy of the Financial Times, and I looked at the front page in 2010, and the entire front page was reports of labor unrest all over the place, big strikes in China, a general strike in Brazil, in South Africa, anti-austerity movements in Europe. And so we began again to collect the data. This is what we've done. This time it includes all global social protest. This is newspaper reports from the New York Times and the Guardian of unrest all around the world. And there are two interesting things here. Again, we see, like in the earlier picture for just labor unrest, we see this rising pattern of unrest, which then stabilizes a bit after the Second World War. And then it collapses in the 1990s. And then we have kind of the return of history here. And if, again, once we update the data, this is 2011, I'm almost certain that, we'll have a little bit of that and we'll be here. Okay. So, to back up a little bit and to say what I think this all means, is that in the periods, in the analogous past periods, social compacts broke down and led to a vicious circle of escalating various forms of social unrest. And that's why we get this. Then we have the period where it's not the end of social unrest, but the whole Second World War period, but it's not accumulating, escalating on a global scale. So what we have here is this kind of simultaneous worldwide unrest all at the same time. Here we have things happening, but they're happening here, they pop up here, and then they pop up here, and then they pop up here. So it remains, high. You can particularly see it. Let me go back just one with the labor. Can I go back one slide? Because you can see it more clearly here with the labor unrest. This is the post-Second World War period. That what's happening here, you don't get this kind of explosiveness, right, of simultaneous worldwide upsurges. But what you do get is this. Things. It's not that things aren't happening. It's just not they're happening on the same simultaneity, and then we get the collapse here. Yeah. So I think where we are, if it's correct that where we are is analogous to here, then we're probably going to be seeing a period. We're entering a period of history of growing social unrest and conflict. One point, or just one, just backward, in the other direction. Dear. Yeah. One more. One more. Yeah. And by now I forgot what I was going to say. I just point out, but leave it for the discussion that that's 1936. So we can talk about the implications of that being 1936. Okay, so I can understand if we were here and we're sort of coming around like this, what is this going to look like in comparison to this? So in other words, we shouldn't be thinking about returning to the post-Second World War order as a solution. So developmentalist states, I think that we need to be putting our brains towards something Brazil pattern over 5 centuries of historical capitalism. And I'm just going to point this out, but not talk about it. But he shows like a move from the main leading governmental organization organizing the system from a city-state to nation-state to something short of a world state, but this idea of larger, more complex organizations. Let me say here too that this is a description of the past, but it doesn't mean it's a prediction about the future. So the fact that the leading governmental organizations get larger and more complex doesn't mean that it's a prediction that there's going to be a world state next. It only means that if we stay on the same path that we've been on of historical capitalism, that would be the next logical step. I'm going to skip over this extensive back and forth, and just want to point out a key thing here. So in discussing the complexity of the system over time, IRID points out how the Dutch internalized the costs of protection, right? And so in terms of military protection. The British, by bringing in factories within the system, internalized the cost of production. The United States cycle internalized the cost of transaction, which is partly a reference to multinational corporations, is partly a reference to what Leo was saying about consumerism and the way in which mass consumption becomes a central part of the profitability of capitalism. And then this says no, 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 and that's reproduction. So this is the question of the internalization of the costs of reproduction, of labor, and of nature. And so the argument here is that one thing that's characterized all of historical capitalism, as long as we've known it, is that it's been based on an externalization of the costs of reproduction of nature and of the costs of reproduction of labor. And that, of course, even though Marx in Volume 1 of Capital starts with the presumption that labor is paid its full costs of reproduction and wages, that he never actually thinks that's historically the case. And in fact, we know historically the case has been this long externalization for big chunks of the world population, and of course the problem of the externalization of nature. So the profitability of historical capitalism has been fundamentally based on this externalization of the cost of reproduction and nature. And so the key, if we go back to that second lesson, the second lesson was about resolving the problems that had been left behind by the previous hegemon, and clearly the problem left behind by all previous systemic cycles of accumulation is this problem of labor and nature. And so this is, I think this is actually the final slide, because I was told that I am too gloomy. I don't know if this is gloomy or not, but probably it's been based on externalization of the cost of reproduction of humans and natures. It's a fundamental problem. And then the question is, why has it been a problem that has not yet been resolved? And then the question is whether it's resolvable through the logic of capitalism. So logic of capitalism, I think that should, in Portuguese, it should be what? Dinaro? Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So that's the logic of capitalism, logic of socialism, or at least not capitalism, is one where utility, where the logic of human action and systemic logic and the logic of human action and agency is toward human welfare and protecting human beings and protecting the planet. So that, I think, is where I want to end, in the sense that what I'm saying, and what Leo was actually also saying about the need to really focus our transformative energies, it's on finding ways to shift our logic from this to this. Okay, thank you.